Sector Report is proudly brought to you by Tower, Rural Insurance Specialists.
Welcome to Tower Sector Report. I'm David Beatson. In this edition, it's all about protection from pests and those pesky politicians. We'll see how MAF Biosecurity works at keeping pests and diseases on the other side of our borders. Stephen Browning tells us why the Soil and Health Association and Federated Farmers are on the same side this time. And Labour leader Phil Goff. He's a farmer, but is he farmer-friendly? Trade and travel are key drivers of our economy, and the real driver of trade is agriculture. We're a heavyweight primary producer, and we export more than 80% of our food production. At the same time, we import just 18% of all the food we buy. Nevertheless, those imports can pose a substantial risk. And if we don't step up biosecurity at the border, MAF estimates that over the next decade, we'll see some 500 new pests establish themselves here, and it'll cost more than $925 million to control them. Our Rural Affairs correspondent Drew Chappell has been out on biosecurity watch.
This is our first and last line of defence. The MAF Biosecurity inspection team on our borders is solely responsible for ensuring any produce that enters the country is disease, pest and stowaway free. Each year we import around 20% of our consumed fresh produce, totalling around $3 billion worth of imports, as well as thousands of plants and live animals. So it's up to the Ministry of Agriculture and freight inspectors like Andrea Smith to make sure everything is clean and safe for entry into New Zealand.
Our export industry is just as important as our import industry, so yeah, we've got to look after what comes in and make sure that it's clean and not going to let something in that's going to ruin everything here.
Most of our imported produce is thoroughly cleaned and treated long before it reaches our shores, but our industry is simply too important for inspectors to take chances. Random samples are examined and checked from each pallet that arrives here, in this case by air. Fresh produce with a relatively short lifespan, such as these Australian strawberries, are usually transported around the world in chilled aircraft compartments, providing us with good, tasty fruit out of season. These products behind me have recently arrived from the Pacific Islands, an assortment of fruit, vegetables and products made from plant materials that all need to be isolated and inspected for MAF's records and our farmers' peace of mind.
These are taro leaves that come in from Tonga. Yeah, we're looking for any signs of like eggs, insects, disease symptoms. We often find like mealybugs and aphids and eggs, sometimes ants as well. We've had fire ants on leaves before.
Our biosecurity history hasn't been a great one. In the early days of New Zealand settlement, things like rats, stoats, rabbits, ferrets, geese, weasels and of course possums were brought here by both Māori and European settlers. The country's flora and fauna couldn't stand up to the new arrivals, and the result is clear to see now. Many of our native bird species are highly endangered, and as for our plants, they're suffering too. And that's without even mentioning gorse or didimo. Painful lessons that have made it all the more important to ensure such mistakes are not repeated. And we've had a few close calls.
We've found like fruit fly that's like come in on different commodities. Yeah, so it ended up getting destroyed.
This evil-looking little insect is a fruit fly. A single one of these in a shipment of produce into the country could cause extensive damage to our horticultural industry, as well as halting exports to our trading partners, also keen to avoid the insects. MAF has intercepted a few at the border over the years, but a nationwide lure and trapping program has failed to catch any, which is good news for farmers. And remember this critter? The gypsy moth hit the headlines in 2003 when one was found in Hamilton, and for good reason, as it's one of the most destructive insects in the world. New Zealand doesn't currently have the fruit fly or the dreaded gypsy moth, and in 1999, when the painted apple moth was discovered here, we eradicated that too, using a spray eradication program in the Auckland area called BTK. It's certainly cheaper though to keep them out of here in the first place. In the imported fruit and vegetable checks, the MAF teams make sure to examine each piece individually for signs of any unusual organisms. This here is a dead juvenile insect found on one of the strawberry leaves, but it's not on the watch list and it has been dealt with at the Australian end of the biosecurity chain already. It may be tiny, but not much gets by these professionals.
There's different commodity specific, like obviously there's import health standard for strawberries from Australia, there's cherries out there from US, so that's a separate import health standard. So yeah, we just follow from where it's come from, basically its origin is what we go by for the import health standard. We're looking for any pests and diseases basically on the produce. Most of the stuff is treated, but not all, so it depends where it comes from as to what you target. But yeah, anything pest-wise or disease-wise, lesion-wise, yeah, is what we're looking for.
Yeah.
And yeah, you wouldn't really want to find anything live on stuff that's been treated, because there shouldn't be.
In a country which relies so heavily on its natural systems and resources, we can hardly afford to take any chances on our border. That's why the men and women at MAF Biosecurity really do hold our future in their hands.
Drew Chappell reporting. Well, the biosecurity battle is on, but who's footing the bills? That's the question that has both Federated Farmers and New Zealand Soil and Health Association batting on the same team. That's coming up next on Tower Sector Report. MAF's new approach to biosecurity is a multi-layer effort. It doesn't just happen at the border. The protection effort covers offshore activities, continues while cargoes are in transit, and follows the border checks with domestic surveillance, incursion response and pest management. But what part of the cost of this protection should the protected industries have to pay? And is the new system as sound as it seems? Those are questions that concern Federated Farmers and the New Zealand Soil and Health Association. Stephen Browning from Soil and Health told me what prompted their alliance on biosecurity issues and how far it extends. Stephen, welcome to Tower Sector Report and thanks for joining us. Let's start by establishing what prompted Soil and Health to decide to support Federated Farmers on the matter of Crown funding rather than industry funding for biosecurity at the border.
Well, biosecurity is an issue for the whole country, and to think that a pest is just purely should be looked at in terms of economic terms is a bit narrow, we think. Biosecurity affects everyone from the home gardener through to the conservation estate. And I'll use an example, hadder beetle, that's just another one that's the biosecurity have said, you know, we can't manage, it's away. That is a horticultural pest, it's tomatoes and the solanum family, but there's also indigenous plants, as the poroporo that would affect as well, and they does seem to have taken that into account.
To a degree, however, there's a counter-argument which says that those who benefit most and profit most from the protection should actually contribute more than everybody else. And are you opposed to that principle?
Not totally, and it might have seemed that we were, but no, there's room for industry contribution, but effectively it seemed to be as well a case of dealing with the issue after it was in, and then industry would get in there and help clean it up. Now, I realise that some of the intent is also in terms of prevention and looking at, let's say they're bringing in nursery material or animals or whatever, the protection's there. But really it should be stopping right on the border. Sure, have those response situations. I think it's fantastic to have processes in place for response, but the first place to stop it is before it gets into our border.
Okay, so what you're saying is the border protection process should be Crown funded,
Yep.
and any remedial process should actually be a shared cost.
Well, and there again, if the Crown was really onto it, there would be a lot less incidents of that. So, for example,
To be sure, but if you're in a situation where you're really beefing up protection at the border, in the hope that you will save an industry remedy costs down the road, that industry surely has a responsibility to contribute something.
Oh yes, and the psyllid, for example, it is now in. We're not sure when it got in and how lax border control was or not in terms of it.
Just for those who aren't familiar, psyllid?
Psyllid is a pest, a very, very bad insect pest for both potatoes, but then tomatoes, capsicums and eggplant, those sort of plants again, and others. But that's costing the horticultural industry a huge amount of money. It means a lot more pesticides going on our food as well, which is not desirable. Mm-hmm. And yes, industry's got a vested interest to clean that up. But
is this funding issue, we've been harping on about it, is this funding issue your only concern about the new direction of MAF Biosecurity policy?
No, it isn't.
What are the other concerns?
Well, one is how inspections take place, and one prime example is the transitional facilities where an importer gets to open up their container, let's say, in their warehouse. Could be in some provincial town, could be certainly not down at the wharf where there's the best effort, and sure that they will been trained as to what to look for and how to respond, and they've got some instructions on how to respond, but the conflict of interest there for an importer opening up a container, a butterfly, a lizard, whatever, running out, they might stomp it or whatever, but then to have MAF come and do the tidy up, fumigation, whatever afterwards, further inspection, when they've got customers waiting for that product, when they're all about business and trying to get by that way. I think those inspections should be happening at the wharf, where the facilities are better and the buffer zones are better.
MAF engages in consultation on biosecurity policy development and implementation. Were they warned about the issues that you've just been raising?
Absolutely, and
so whatever they're doing at the moment, they were told at the time the consultation took place.
Yes, and I think they were very good with consultation. I was involved with some of the consultation.
Can they be very good if they didn't take any notice?
Well, they might have a few influences, and Treasury might be part of it, and there will be a range of government departments that will have influenced that final outcome. And I wouldn't blame our MAF Biosecurity New Zealand officials. While I have frustration at times with MAF Biosecurity New Zealand, a lot of the time I see it as a matter of resourcing. They had 60 positions allowed to remain either unfilled or people were made redundant when there's a bit of a dip in trade and they were seen as not necessary. That's hardly the case. We've never inspecting enough, and those positions could have been redeployed.
Despite all this, I mean, are they listening? Are they responsive to the kind of concerns you've been expressing?
I don't think so. I don't see why all containers aren't six-side inspected, for example. Part of their problem, of course, is the government's direction on free trade. We're looking to be importing honey. We don't need a drop of honey here.
Well, I mean, are you actually
disease?
Elevating the argument up to government level, if that's the case? If the consultation's going and you're satisfied that, okay, they're conscious of what you're talking about, but the government is the issue, are you pushing the government?
Yes, I think it's a policy issue.
Yeah.
And it really is. And there's a real... we're hiking down that free trade thing as fast as we can for a few commodities, but we're really putting at risk for a lot more New Zealand for a lot more disease and pests to come into this country. And that's what I'm saying. The honey is a prime example. If we have Australian honey coming in, the chance of then having to use antibiotics routinely in beehives, we've already got the Varroa. We do not need to be putting more chemicals and drugs as such into our honey. Pork industry, we're only, I think we're in New Zealand we're only producing less than 50% of our own pork. Absolutely no need for any pork to come into this country, but with the new regulations and free trade and bringing in, say, raw meat, the chance of new pork disease is very, very high, and that's just not fair to our producers.
So you've been aligning yourself with federated farmers, particularly on the funding issue. Are you aligning with them on other issues, and what are the next steps?
We certainly don't always align ourselves with federated farmers, and it's really good when we have that common area. The next steps, I think, is still aiming at a policy level, and certainly Horticulture New Zealand, federated farmers and other producer groups have been firing in there. I think until we really deal with free trade and proper resourcing of biosecurity in New Zealand, we're going to have ongoing difficulties, and that's, it's crying shame, to be honest.
Stephen Browning, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave.
Stephen Browning from the Soil and Health Association. Coming up, Phil Goff, Labour leader, Cleveland farmer, but how farmer friendly are his policies? Stay with Tower Sector Report. Our next guest is Labour leader Phil Goff, and he's got less than 100 days to pull back National's long-standing lead in the polls if he wants to head the next government of New Zealand after the elections in November. Well, with policies that promise a capital gains tax and accelerate agriculture's entry into the emissions trading scheme, you'd have to ask if Labour's really serious about winning back marginal provincial cities like New Plymouth. So how farm-friendly are Labour's policies? Welcome, Phil.
Hi, David.
You run 20 acres out at Clevedon.
I do.
Have you finished your docking?
we did that on Saturday. So we've injected against pulpy kidney. We docked and we castrated. So not my favourite job, but it's something that comes around every season.
Yeah. Okay. I won't ask any more questions about docking.
No.
But what is the significance of agriculture and those provincial centres as far as you're concerned and as far as Labour's concerned?
Well, agriculture is important to New Zealand, and that's why respective Labour governments have actually looked after agriculture pretty well. And I got to know the farming sector very well as Minister of Trade, negotiating the Chinese Free Trade Agreement, the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, and a big part of what we were doing was breaking down barriers to market entry, making sure that our farmers could get their produce into overseas markets. But I think Labour was also very forward-looking in things like research and development. The $700 million Fast Forward Fund would have been a huge boom to agriculture, and it's a shame that was scrapped by National.
We'll come back a bit on that later, but just in terms of policy formulation now, do you actually test run your policy ideas to see how they'll go down? And do you have a farmer focus group actually giving you some feedback?
Well, we do basically what we think is right for the country. Do we listen to what people are saying?
The short answer to that, then no.
No, the short answer is that you've got to do the right thing. And, you know, in your intro, you suggested that policies like a capital gains tax, would go down like a lead balloon. Actually, in the poll results last night, when people in New Zealand were asked to choose between Labour's policy of a capital gains tax or National's policy of selling off our assets, 53% went with Labour's policy and 31% with National's. And there's a lot of farmers out there that understand that the big problems that they had in the last decade was a housing boom fuelled from Auckland, pushing up inflation, pushing up interest rates and pushing up exchange rates.
Sure,
so they know why a capital gains tax can actually help.
You're challenging what perception was behind the question. I mean, what do your neighbours tell you out at Clevedon about Labour policy? Do they actually have that worldly view that you're talking about?
Oh, look, I go right around provincial New Zealand. I talk to a lot of people, and I talk to people in the farming sector quite regularly. What people are often telling me about that is, look, we don't want to farm for capital gain. We want to farm for the productive worth of the land. But what's worrying us is that the value of the farmland has exceeded the productive value. People are coming in from overseas, buying up our farmland, and it's harder than ever for the young intending farmer to get on the land. And they don't regard that as a good thing. They regard that as a bad thing, and National's doing nothing about it.
Equally, there are a lot of farmers who've had to predicate their whole working lives on the idea of taking a capital gain at the end of the day, about trying to keep the cost of production down, trying to boost their farm values by improvement. And they see that triple whammy of policies of accelerating entry to the emissions trading scheme, the capital gains tax, and the tighter controls on farm sales to foreign buyers as something that's actually going to hit the value of their property.
Well, look, yeah, people that take a very narrow view can say this will affect me negatively and I don't like it. But people that take the wider view and say what's good for farming, what's good for the next generation, what's good for my kids, they'll take a different view on that. They'll understand why a capital gains tax actually is helpful to shifting investment money from the speculative area into the productive area. They'll understand why that's important in helping keep the exchange rate at a level where our farming sector can be competitive. They'll understand the importance of enabling young New Zealanders to actually be the next generation of farmers, and not simply tenants in their own land.
They actually see this troika of policies as hitting them very heavily compared to other sectors of the population.
Well, not so, because the emissions trading scheme already applies if you're New Zealand Steel, if you're an aluminium smelter, if you're in the transport sector. And somebody has to pay for the emissions. 48% of our emissions, they're agricultural.
But farmers will be paying too in terms of buying petrol and diesel.
Of course, but we all do. We all do that. We all do that.
Equipment.
That's not relevant to the argument here, David. What's relevant to the argument is that 48% of our emissions come from our livestock. Now, that's not to blame the farmers for that, but unless we incentivise a change in technology and deal with that problem, then the taxpayer will be paying the tens of billions of dollars that Treasury have said are the result of the current form of the emissions trading scheme.
You haven't actually got a political argument in principle on that anyway, because National would plan to bring
well, they bring it in
into the scheme in 2015.
Yeah,
so
just
there's not
for
argument in
2
principle.
years.
But can I ask you whether it's practical to actually accelerate, because you aren't actually dealing with carbon so much in farming. You're dealing with methane, nitrous oxide,
that's
different gases, whole new ballgame. Is the system in place to actually enable you to accelerate the introduction?
Oh yeah, look, it was always intended to come in 2013. It was only changed latterly, and not for policy reasons, but for political reasons by the National Party.
Having changed it, can you change it back again?
Oh yeah,
of
course you
rapidly.
can, and our policy has been consistent all the way through.
That?
Yeah, I am sure about that, and farmers won't be surprised about our policy because they know that is the policy that we've adhered to consistently.
We're still exporting commodities, and do you want to get New Zealand agriculture into this area of cost ahead of global competitors like Australia? I mean, well, agriculture is not going to be brought under the Australian scheme.
No, but Australia has a different set of problems. It's called brown coal and it's called electricity generation. They are tackling that problem because that is the bulk of their emissions. Now, I'm sorry, the biggest part of our emissions, 48%, is actually agricultural emissions. We cannot have a system that deals with global warming unless we start to tackle that problem.
We're not going to do diddly in terms of the total picture of global warming, are we?
Well,
New Zealand's contribution will be a minuscule proportion of
in terms of the absolute level.
Why should we actually accelerate?
In terms of the absolute level, that's right. In terms of the amount of carbon emissions per capita, we're actually relatively high. Now, for years, I promoted New Zealand agriculture as clean, green, 100% pure. It's branding that the marketing people tell us is worth billions of dollars a year. You cannot have a brand and not live up to that brand. You have to walk the talk, or that will cost us dearly in terms of a new wave of protectionism that will be against New Zealand on the basis of it not dealing with its environmental problems.
Can I ask you, when you thought about it, was it an aspirational brand? As the Prime Minister now said.
No. Look,
it's
a way that New Zealanders think about themselves. But when we see the latest reports on, what's happening in our rivers, our lakes, our Hauraki Gulf, you realise that unless we actually start to live up to the goal that we've set ourselves, and that's what it is, it's a goal of being 100% pure, then we lose credibility and we get branded as hypocrites. We can't afford to do that in a world that is always looking for excuses to stop New Zealand produce going into their markets.
Let me pick up on a point there. Right now, we've got the Greens talking about imposing water charges on farmers drawing on rivers and streams to irrigate their properties, maybe adding $40,000 to $50,000 a year to their cost. Would you accept that as part of a deal to form a coalition government?
Well, I haven't looked at the detail of their policy, and you've just got to be rather careful that you don't put the whole weight of the cost of that policy disproportionately on one particular group. Will farmers have to make a contribution to cleaning up the waterways? Of course, because they're primarily involved. It needs to be done on a fair basis, and it needs to be affordable. But Labor has an absolute commitment to cleaning up our waterways. That's why we put $70 million into cleaning up the lakes in Rotorua. Here was the jewel in the crown of our tourist industry, and our lakes were in a shocking state. We had to act, and we did.
Phil Goff, thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
Labor leader Phil Goff, and that's all for now. Remember, you can catch our show again anytime via the internet at www.country99tv.co.nz. Thanks for your company. I'm David Beatson for Tower Sector Report. Bye for now.
Sector Report was proudly brought to you by Tower, Rural Insurance Specialists.